Hello and welcome to this episode of the Academic Papers Podcast, where we celebrate academia and bring education to everyone.
Today we'll be taking a deep dive into a paper.
It's about a really interesting way to teach evolution.
You submitted this one right. Looks like you're interested in how we can make complex science more engaging.
Definitely. This seems like such an unexpected combination. Evolution, math, and comics. Let's unpack why these researchers think it's a winning formula.
Well, one thing they emphasize is that biology education often gets stuck at a very descriptive level, memorizing facts and terms.
Like the parts of a cell,
Yeah.
or the stages of mitosis.
Exactly. But the researchers argue that this doesn't reflect how biologists actually work. In the real world, biology relies heavily on math for things like modeling analysis and prediction.
So it's about going beyond just the what of biology and digging into the how and the why, using math as a tool.
Precisely. And they point out that this is especially true in evolutionary biology. For instance, the Hardy-Weinberg principle. You might remember that from high school biology. It uses math to model how gene frequencies change in populations over time.
Okay, that one rings a bell. But I definitely need a refresher.
Well, the key takeaway is that even something as fundamental as evolution relies on mathematical models to understand its mechanisms.
And the article goes even further, right? It talks about how math is used to model the evolution of things like HIV and COVID-19.
Exactly. Mathematical models are essential for understanding how these viruses spread, mutate, and adapt. This helps scientists develop effective treatments and vaccines.
It's amazing to think about how math is being used to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing humanity.
It really is. And that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, comics.
Okay, so we've got the biology and the math. But how do comics fit into all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. The researchers argue that comics aren't just for entertainment, they can actually be powerful tools for learning.
Now, I love a good graphic novel, but I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical about using them to teach complex science.
I understand your skepticism, but hear me out. Comics have this unique ability to combine visuals, storytelling, and information in a way that's both engaging and accessible.
So it's about using the power of narrative and imagery to make the science stick.
Exactly. And research backs this up. Studies have shown that comics can improve scientific literacy, creativity, and critical thinking skills in students.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential here.
Yeah.
But how did these researchers actually put this idea into practice? Did they create their own comic?
They did. They designed a comic specifically to teach about natural selection, and they chose a fascinating subject to illustrate the concept.
Tell me more. What creature did they choose as their star?
The red palm weevil. It's a beetle found in tropical areas of Asia, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia. And here's why it's perfect for illustrating natural selection. Red palm weevils come in a variety of colors, from bright orange to dark black.
So you can see how different colors might be advantageous or disadvantageous in different environments, leading to changes in the population over time.
Exactly. And the comic is set in a tropical area during the day, reflecting the weevil's natural habitat and highlighting the researchers' attention to detail.
That's a good sign. It shows they're really thinking about how to make the biology accurate and relevant.
Absolutely. Now, to make the comic even more engaging, they decided to use a manga-inspired style called chibi.
I've heard of chibi. It's that super cute style with the big heads and small bodies, right?
Got it. Chibi is very popular in Japanese comics and animation, and it has a playful, approachable feel that can make complex topics less intimidating.
I can definitely see that. It's like a visual gateway drug to science.
And speaking of making science approachable, the researchers also made a conscious decision to feature two kid characters, a boy and a girl, as the main protagonists.
Okay, so we've got colorful beetles, cute chibi art, and kid-friendly characters. What's the actual story of the comic?
Well, it starts with the kids catching red palm weevils and noticing the different color variations.
So they're already observing that natural variation within the population. That's a key ingredient for natural selection.
Right. Then they compare their catch to a video showing red palm weevils in a different location. But in this video, the weevils are mostly brown and black, with very few orange ones.
Ooh, that's a great way to spark curiosity and get the kids and the readers thinking about why there might be a difference in color frequencies between the two locations.
Exactly. And that's where the natural selection explanation comes in.
So the kids in the comic start piecing together how natural selection might have favored different colors in different environments.
Exactly. And here's where the math comes in. The researchers use a variety of graphs and visual aids to help explain the process of natural selection. And they do it in a really clever way.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about how they integrate the math into the story.
Well, one thing they do is use normal distribution curves, those classic bell curves you might remember from statistics, to show the initial variation in weevil colors.
I remember those. They show how a treat-like color is distributed in a population.
Right. They use a red bell curve to show the distribution of colors in the first location, where the kids caught a mix of orange and black weevils.
So the red curve represents the before picture of natural selection.
Exactly. Then they introduce a blue bell curve to show how natural selection, driven by environmental pressures, might have shifted the distribution of colors in the second location, where brown and black weevils are more common.
Ah, so the blue curve represents the after picture, showing how the population has changed over time.
Precisely. And by using two different colors, they make it easier to visually compare the before and after effects of natural selection.
That's really clever. It's like a visual representation of how evolution shapes populations over time.
And it's just one example of how they weave math seamlessly into the comic's narrative.
I'm really impressed with how they're managing to combine all these elements. This is shaping up to be one fascinating deep dive.
I agree. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's much more to explore in this research, so buckle up.
I'm ready for it. What else did they discover about the effectiveness of this approach? Let's dive deeper.
So we've talked about how the researchers combined biology, math, and comics to create this unique learning experience.
But did they actually test whether it worked? I mean, did the comic actually help students understand natural selection better?
That's a great question, and one the researchers addressed head-on.
I'm all ears.
They dug into some of the common misconceptions about natural selection, the ones that often trip students up.
I can see how that would be important.
Wow.
Natural selection can be tricky even for adults.
Exactly. One study they cited found that many students believe natural selection actually reduces genetic variation in populations.
Which is the opposite of what happens. Natural selection acts on existing variation, but it also generates new variation through processes like mutation and recombination.
Right. It's a dynamic process that both shapes and is shaped by genetic diversity.
I'm guessing the comic tackled that misconception head on.
It did. The comic emphasizes how natural selection leads to changes in the frequencies of existing traits, but it doesn't eliminate variation altogether.
Okay, that makes sense. What other misconceptions did they address?
Another big one is the idea that adaptation is a conscious process, that organisms can somehow choose to evolve certain traits.
Ah, the classic Lamarckian view, like giraffes stretching their necks to reach higher leaves and passing on those longer necks to their offspring.
Exactly. The comic clarifies that evolution doesn't work that way. It's about random mutations and the environmental pressures that favor certain traits over others.
So the comic helps debunk that myth of intentional adaptation and reinforces the role of chance and environmental factors.
Precisely. And they also address the often misunderstood role of mutations.
Mutations, those random changes in DNA that are the raw material of evolution.
Exactly. The comic explains how mutations, while often random and unpredictable, can sometimes be beneficial, giving an organism an advantage in a particular environment.
So it's not about mutations being good or bad inherently, but about whether they help an organism survive and reproduce in its specific context.
That's the key takeaway. The comic really emphasizes that point.
I like how they're addressing these common stumbling blocks. It seems like they're really trying to create a solid foundation for understanding natural selection.
They are, and they don't just focus on the conceptual understanding, they also bring in those mathematical models to help students visualize and analyze evolutionary processes.
Right, we were talking about those bell curves earlier.
Exactly. But they go beyond that, too.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, for instance, they use pie charts, which, despite their simplicity, can be quite effective for showing changes in proportions.
I can see that. A pie chart is a really visual way to represent how different groups within a population change over time.
Right. And they use a specific type of pie chart, called an exploded pie chart, to highlight those changes.
Wait, an exploded pie chart? I've never heard of that.
It's basically a regular pie chart, but one or more slices are pulled out or exploded to emphasize them.
Ah, so it's a way to visually draw attention to specific changes in the data.
Exactly. In the comic, they use this technique to show how the proportion of different colored weevils changes due to natural selection.
That's a great visual tool. I can see how that would help students grasp the concept of shifting proportions within a population.
And they even managed to incorporate linear equations into the comic.
Wow, linear equations in a comic about beetles. That's impressive.
They use a scenario involving rabbit populations. to introduce the concept of carrying capacity.
Carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals an environment can support.
Exactly. They show how a population can grow exponentially until it hits its carrying capacity, at which point the growth levels off.
And they use a linear equation to represent that change.
Yes. And then they show that same equation as a graph, so students can see the visual representation of the population growth curve.
So they're connecting the abstract mathematical concept to a concrete visual representation.
Exactly. And by doing so, they're reinforcing the idea that math can be a powerful tool for understanding biological phenomena.
It's all about those interdisciplinary connections.
Right. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of this research. It shows how we can break down those traditional silos between subjects and present a more integrated, holistic view of science.
I'm really struck by how much thought and creativity went into designing this comic. They really considered every detail.
They did. And the result is a learning experience that's not only informative, but also engaging and fun.
And that's so important, right? When learning is enjoyable, it becomes so much more meaningful and memorable.
Absolutely. This comic isn't just about teaching students about natural selection. It's about fostering a love of science and a curiosity about the world around them.
It's inspiring to see such a creative approach to science education.
It is. And it makes me wonder what other innovative techniques are out there just waiting to be discovered.
That's a great question. Are there any other examples of comics being used to teach science?
There are. In fact, there's a growing movement to use comics and graphic novels in STEM education.
Really? I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, there are some really compelling reasons why comics are so effective for teaching science.
Okay, let's dig into those reasons. I'm ready to explore the wider world of comics and science education. So we've seen how this particular comic brings together biology, math, and storytelling to teach about natural selection.
But it's part of a larger trend, right? You mentioned a growing movement using comics in STEM education.
Exactly. I'm curious, why are comics such an effective tool for teaching science? What is it about this format that works so well?
Well, one key factor is their visual nature. Comics can illustrate complex processes and concepts in a way that's much easier to grasp than just text alone.
It's like that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Exactly. And in science, where you're often dealing with abstract ideas and microscopic structures, having those visual representations can make a huge difference in understanding.
I can imagine it's especially helpful for visual learners. But I bet it benefits everyone to some extent.
Absolutely. Another strength of comics is their ability to tap into the power of narrative. Humans are natural storytellers and listeners. We're wired to connect with stories.
That makes sense. A good story can draw you in and make even the most complex topic feel more engaging.
Exactly. And when you embed scientific concepts within a compelling narrative, it helps make the information more meaningful and memorable.
It's like sneaking the vegetables into the pasta sauce.
I like that analogy. And comics can also help make science more relatable and less intimidating.
Especially if they feature characters and storylines that resonate with the reader.
Right. Seeing characters grapple with scientific concepts and apply them to solve problems can make those concepts seem more accessible and relevant to students' own lives.
It humanizes the science, making it feel less like something out of a textbook and more like something they can actually understand and use.
Precisely. And comics can also be a great way to introduce different perspectives and challenge stereotypes about who can be a scientist.
Like in the Red Palm Weevil comic, where both the boy and girl characters play active roles in exploring the science.
Exactly. Comics can showcase the diversity of the scientific community and inspire a wider range of students to pursue STEM careers.
It's about showing that science is for everyone, not just a select few.
And that's a really powerful message.
It is. This whole conversation has really opened my eyes to the potential of comics as a teaching tool.
It's exciting to see how educators are finding creative ways to engage students and make science more accessible.
And it's not just about using comics in the classroom, right? There's a whole world of science comics out there for anyone who wants to learn more about the world around them.
Absolutely. From graphic novels about historical figures in science to webcomics exploring cutting-edge research, there's something out there for everyone.
It's like a whole new genre of science communication.
Exactly. And it's a genre that's only going to grow in the years to come.
I'm convinced. I'm adding some science comics to my reading list for sure.
I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what you find.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the power of comics.
Me too. It's a reminder that learning can be both informative and entertaining.
A big thank you to our expert for guiding us through this research.
It is my pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you want to learn more about this study on using comics to teach natural selection,
You can find the full article on academicjobs.com. Just search for Fadhlan Muchlas Abrori, Mathias Tejera, and Zsolt Lavicza.
until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the world of knowledge.